Welcome back to Football Weather. Galen, Clavio, Matt Blaszka joining you once again. We're taping this on Wednesday, December 17th. College football playoff is right around the corner. First game's Friday night. Matt, we've been building up all season to this moment. It's a lot. It's exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. How you doing, my friend?
I'm excited. I realize we haven't talked in 10 days since we last spoke on the pod. You had no voice. We didn't have any bowl games played yet. We missed the Bucked Up Bowl. What else has been going on? Michigan coaching search.
Yeah, a lot's happened in the last week. It's wild, man. I mean, I'm befuddled at how college football continues to deliver the goods.
Yeah, off season, in season, it's still all going on at the same time.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. So we're going to talk about all those things. We're going to talk playoff matchups. We've got 4 of them this weekend, which will then determine the next 4 games in the quarterfinals. We already know who those teams are that are the hosts, the top seeds, but we got to figure out who they're going to play. We're going to talk about Sharon Moore and Michigan and maybe a couple other things before this is out, plus an interview with Bryan Curtis, editor-at-large for The Ringer, and also a big college football fan, grew up in Texas, went to UT Austin. We talked with him a bit about IU. We talked to them about the college football playoff landscape and the media elements of it. So a lot of fun stuff coming up on this show. Hopefully you enjoy it. Matt, we are, of course, brought to you by Home Field Apparel, the place to go for the finest in college fashions. Matt's got his old – we did not plan this. I just want to know. Matt wore the Ole Miss shirt. I've got the Tulane green wave on, and that happens to be one of our first-round matchups in the CFP in the Grove in Oxford, Mississippi. You can get some delightful apparel yourself from Home Field Apparel by going to homefieldapparel.com and shopping their extensive array of pretty much everything under the sun. They've been doing some amazing drops. If you're an Indiana fan, as many of you are, some amazing Rose Bowl-related apparel, and they will certainly have a bunch of new apparel coming up if Indiana proceeds through the college football playoff. They had some great Big Ten championship drops as well. Use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com. Be sure to check them out. They'll be all over the college football playoff as they have been all over the college football season. So Matt, let's get launched in on this. Let's start with talking about these playoff matchups, and we might as well use the one that we are dressed for at this point. Tulane versus Ole Miss. This is not the first game of the weekend. This is one of the 2 sacrificial lambs, so to speak, to the NFL, as this one's going to be the middle game on Saturday. These 2 teams have played already this season. It was not close. Ole Miss won that game by a pretty significant margin. It's one of those games, though, that when I think about how this is likely to go, it's got the most questions of any of the games in the first round as far as I'm concerned, because of Lane Kiffin's departure, because of John Summerall's departure, because of the overall atmosphere around Ole Miss and the big question marks about whether they'll be able to translate what they did in the regular season to the postseason. And I think it's the one that for a lot of people, they've already checked off in their head along with another game. It's like, well, that's not even worth looking at. I always get nervous about those sorts of games in playoff situations because that's generally when the biggest surprises happen.
This is interesting. If you've listened to Pete Golding here the last 3 weeks, he sounds like a guy ready to run through a wall. He doesn't seem like a head coach because he's a defensive coordinator, has that really high energy type kick. A lot of swearing in his podcast, in his interviews and everything else. He's definitely a unique guy. It's going to be interesting to see how they react. I'm sure they'll come out with a lot of energy now. If this sort of happened 2 weeks ago, the energy may be a little bit higher, but they've now had 3 weeks to prepare for Tulane, if you will, and they've already beaten them 45-10 earlier in the season. So it's been a couple months since they've played. So I am curious how they come out. Obviously, the home crowd's going to be a big advantage, I think, as we saw that last year, right? And it's worth mentioning last year the home teams were 4-0 in that first round game. We mentioned this offline last year when we were watching some of these games. Like, it's hard to go to win on the road. Now it's really hard to go to win on the road when you've had a couple of weeks off. Yeah. And both these coaches have 2 jobs, or not. One coach has 2 jobs. The other one's is the new head coach. So it's going to be a really fun matchup. I think it will be a lot closer than people think. It would seem that Tulane is really going to be prepared for this. Ole Miss, again, the question marks, what's the offensive staff? I know they still have the OC, but he's splitting jobs. So it's really interesting to see how this is going to play out from both angles, right? From the I'm not JMU. I'm struggling today. The Tulane and the Ole Miss aspect.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the statistical breakdowns of these two teams, it's somewhat dependent on what you're looking at. But one of the things that we talked about a lot in the lead up to the playoff selection process was that Tulane might have been the most overvalued of the group of 6 teams in terms of what they brought to the table. And we noticed this early on where they were getting ranked by the committee, they were getting ranked by the pollsters, and it was largely on the back of having played a tougher schedule and the fact that, you know, you go back to September early in the season, they knocked off Duke at home 34-27. Impressive win. They also knocked off Northwestern, who ended up being a bowl team 23-3. The problem was when they went to Ole Miss, they got boat raced. They lost that game 45-10. They lost to UT San Antonio 48-26, and they just weren't a very overwhelming team from a statistical perspective throughout the course of the year. You look at their efficiency numbers, and they were 44th in the country in offense. They were 52nd in defense, according to FPI, and their S&P Plus numbers were not a whole lot better. They were 42nd in S&P Plus, 28th in offense, 68th in defense. Whereas Ole Miss, I almost feel like got underrated because they didn't have a second big win outside of the Oklahoma victory that they had this year. But realistically, Ole Miss has played at a really high statistical level throughout the course of this season. They were 7th in S&P Plus. If you look at efficiencies in FPI, they were 15th, which is still really good. And then in overall FPI, when you take recruiting and other things into account, they were 12th. So I think Ole Miss came into if they had come into this playoff without all the Kiffin drama, they would have been a really legitimate dark horse candidate to win a couple games and maybe get to the college football playoff final simply because of how well they played. The big uncertainty right now with Ole Miss is simply with everything that team has been through since the Egg Bowl, how does that translate to the playoff, a high pressure situation, a situation that most of those players, maybe all of them, have not been in. I haven't checked. I don't know who transferred in from playoff teams last year,
right.
But they've also got a quarterback in Chambliss who is played very well, but this is as big of a leap as playing in the SEC was this year. This is a whole nother leap from what he was dealing with last season. And I really do wonder how he handles that pressure environment. It's not, and it's nothing against him. It's really just a matter of you never know how a player is going to play in an environment where it is all or nothing and the eyes of the entire college football establishment are upon you.
Yeah, you have to wonder too for the Ole Miss players if some of the weight's off their shoulders because they went in the Mississippi State game knowing they had to probably win that game, knowing their coach was half there, half not. You know, you're reading the tea leaves the last 3 weeks. It seemed like they had a pretty good idea he wasn't coming back, and now that he's gone, you know, hate to use the word house money, but like they're 4 games away from winning a national championship at Ole Miss. So certainly, you know, everything's in place for them to obviously win this game. They play Georgia if they win, so they have some familiarity. They played Georgia really tight earlier in the year. So, you know, getting off the mat here, they haven't played in 3 weeks. That's always a little bit of a concern, you know, for any bowl team, having that much time off, the extra couple weeks, where Tulane played 2 weeks ago, right? So they've played a little more recently. It'll be curious, as I don't know if you saw, they're the highest ticket price to get in. So certainly a lot of Ole Miss fans have bought into this. They've rallied around this team. Now it's time for them to go out there and, you know, put up and win this game, you know, hopefully for them going away. But I think Tulane will put up a nice fight.
Yeah, second highest ticket price, I think, of any of the games coming up here this weekend. The highest, of course, is actually not an FBS game. It's Montana State Part 2.
Yeah.
Which now is a get-in price of $654, which, but no, you bring up a really good point about Ole Miss. And I think that I've never really, this is the team I've had the hardest time getting a handle on all season because you forget that they were leading Georgia in the fourth quarter in Athens. You know, they were up 35-26 with 4:12 remaining. We're really all the way into the fourth quarter. It wasn't until, Gunnar Stockton hit Nate Frazier at the beginning of the fourth quarter. That just cut it to 2. UGA didn't take the lead until halfway through the fourth quarter in that game. But then you also look at them and you say to yourself, well, they beat Oklahoma. They don't have a lot else on their resume that really makes you think that this is a dominant team. And they struggled a bit against Florida at home, right when all the Kiffin drama had kicked up. So there's just a lot of question marks. Probably the team I have the most question marks in the entirety of the playoff is Ole Miss. They have the talent to do a lot. Sure. Will they is the big question. And then as far as Tulane's concerned, the FEI projection in this game, and I think FEI's got some pretty good projections overall, is essentially 38-20, about an 18-point spread in favor of Ole Miss. That probably feels fair. The line on this game right now, let me
17.5.
17.5. So it's right at that line. But this is where I think Tulane, if they can come out and learn some lessons from that game earlier in the season, they could certainly make it uncomfortable for Ole Miss. And I'm just really curious to see how the first quarter of this game goes, because Tulane's not going to win it in the first quarter, but they could certainly lose it in the first quarter if they're not careful.
Yeah, and one thing to point out is the coach who's now going to Florida has been all in. I don't know if you've watched any of his material. He's worn the halfway mask and all that kind of stuff. It's been really fun to watch him. It's two different ways it's been handled between him and Lane Kiffin on an exit. I'm curious. Obviously, John Summerall is going to do really good stuff in Florida. You would hope, or at least Florida hopes, that he's prepared for this game to go out there and win and keep the season going for Tulane.
Yeah. Let's switch gears and talk about the other evening game, for lack of a better term, on Saturday, the other game that got sacrificed to the NFL and to Turner. Oregon hosting James Madison. Last year, Oregon came in undefeated, won the Big Ten by number 1 seed, Rose Bowl. So they didn't get to host. They have to play Ohio State, and Ohio State just kind of smushed them in the first half. They never really recovered from that. Oregon has not had the same season that they had last year. They lose at home to Indiana, but they didn't lose again. They won some tight games. Now they're the 5 seed, and they get to host James Madison, who got in over Duke as the ACC champion. A James Madison team that you could argue should be the 11 seed instead of the 12 if you look at just the raw power numbers. A really tough task, though, for James Madison to have to travel all the way across the country and play in Autzen Stadium, a place where only Indiana and Washington have won in recent memory. This feels like a game where Oregon goes out and asserts their will. What chance does James Madison have in this one, in your opinion?
It would seem very little. I mean, obviously, I hope they score first. And honestly, if you're on Twitter, X, or whatever, you're not following JMU News, you must be doing. You need to do that soon. It is a fantastic account, talking about the matchup in a really fun way with Oregon. This is going to be a tough one. We talked about this on our live pod. They deserve to make it. They earned the spot in. I don't want to hear anything else. They earned it, right? That's the top one, the 5th Group of 5 champion. That's part of the formula. That's the standard. With this matchup, Oregon's playing really well since that Indiana game. It's at home. It's actually a true night game, really, right? It will probably be night out there for a change. It won't be this 4 o'clock, 3:30 game. So it's going to be a tough task. Oregon's been playing really. Oregon's a dark horse for me. But Dante Moore finally seems to be getting in gear. The whole team, hopefully getting healthy. I haven't seen their latest report if those receivers are going to be back. But this is a nice ramp up. I hate to say it that way, but nice ramp up for Oregon getting into the next round.
Yeah, it feels that way. Oregon has been underrated this year because they don't have a signature victory. I mean, I guess the closest that they've got is the home win versus USC. And that was certainly an impressive win. They won that game by a pretty decisive margin. They win at Washington. That was good. They won at Iowa in a close game. But what should have been their signature win was the Penn State win, and that essentially got taken away from them from Penn State collapsing over the course of the next couple of weeks afterwards. So statistically speaking, this is a really strong Oregon team. If you believe FPI, it is the 3rd best team in the country. If you believe S&P Plus, it's the 4th best team in the country. And if you look at FEI, it's the 5th best team in the country. So by any statistical measure, they have played at the level of a top 5 team all season. And you would think that would give them a really good chance at competing for the national championship just off of what they've done. Their weaknesses feel like weaknesses that can't really be exploited effectively by James Madison.
Yeah.
And that's a real shame because James Madison has had a really good season. And you look at them, I mean, they're 24th in S&P Plus, they're 28th in FPI. And when you break down what they've done in terms of their on-field efficiencies, where their real strength is in their defense. It's their offense that's let them down a bit. They're only about 50th in the country in offensive efficiency, according to FPI. And so with them, what I worry about is, can they, S&P Plus likes their offense more. They're 22nd there. Can they score enough to give their defense a chance to make some plays and make life difficult on Dante Moore? I'm also curious, like, how healthy did Oregon get over these last few weeks? Because they had been really banged up going into this break. How well did they take advantage of that? Dan Lanning's probably going to have his team fired up, and there's probably some additional motivation given how poorly their playoff appearance went last year.
I was just going to say that I feel like they probably learned a big lesson last year. And, they were 13-0, and they got fed Ohio State for being, the weird playoff format last year. So a little bit probably unlucky getting that as a first game after having 24 days off. They're going to have a similar time off here to ramp up for this playoff game. So you would think that after last year's experience, they would certainly be ready for this game. I don't think Dan Lanning is saying, oh, this is a layup. You have to go in there every game and win for sure. And having this on their home field, after, again, of what happened last year, is probably a nice reward for how they played this year. They deserve to be the 5. We even talked maybe they should have been the 4 seed at one point. But this is a nice runway for them to get to that Texas Tech game in a couple weeks.
Let's go ahead. By the way, the FEI projection on this game, not as close as the last one. This essentially has Oregon winning 38-13. So roughly
spread's 21.
Yeah, spread's 21. So between 21 and 23 is what it appears everybody's thinking, which seems reasonable, I would say. And I just hope that it's a good game at this point.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Let's go to the other game that's happening on Saturday, the first game, a game that's being played at 11 a.m. local time.
The Notre Dame Bowl.
The Notre Dame Bowl, yes. The two teams that beat Notre Dame, Texas A&M and Miami. This is really a tale of two different teams. A team in Miami that had to scrap their way back into the playoff conversation over the course of the last half of the season versus an A&M team that was considered the equal and in some corners even the superior of Ohio State and Indiana, who ends up finishing very poorly, almost loses against South Carolina, loses against Texas, doesn't make the SEC title game, and ends up getting knocked all the way down to 7th in the pecking order. So they get to host, which is nice for them, a Miami team that has got a ton of talent. Obviously, won against Notre Dame earlier in the season, beat South Florida very handily. Doesn't have a lot of other really marquee victories. Both of these teams with a lot to prove, both of which are national brands with big fan bases that are expecting them to go in and win this game. And this is a really tight game in terms of the numbers. Who do you think comes into this game with the edge?
I like Miami a lot. They've played really well. I know it's not the same caliber. Maybe South Carolina's not as good, but certainly Texas is a really good team. But they blew out their last 4 opponents after that SMU loss in early November, and they've looked really good doing it. And they knew they had to, right? They were 8 spots apart from Notre Dame for when the rankings were released the first time. They had to climb all the way up to even have a chance at this. So they've had a chip on their shoulder for more than 6 weeks. Carson Beck has looked really good. Mario Cristobal seems to have them going. I really like how they're trending. We talked about this with A&M. It's been really suspect for maybe even a month. Like, they have not looked great for a couple of weeks, even past that, even past the Texas A&M, the South Carolina game. Yeah. So I'm really curious how they come out. I know they have the home crowd, and so that is certainly going to help them. But I really am curious if they can regain that mojo they had from earlier in the season. And actually, they haven't really beaten anybody all year, as we know, right? They don't have any playoff wins on their outside Notre Dame on their resume. That was 3 months ago. So is this a team that is falling similar to Alabama, or can they get up for the challenge? Because if they win, then certainly I can see them really playing well and giving Ohio State a game in a couple of weeks. But we haven't seen that in over a month from them.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think I would make the argument that I would rather have Carson Beck than Marcel Reed as my quarterback in this situation, given his experience and background. it's kind of a wash in terms of the skill positions. I think they both got really good skill position players. I'd give A&M the advantage in their offensive line, but I'd give Miami the advantage in their defensive line. It's a very, very tight game. And I just don't know that neither of these teams has proven that they should be trusted in what they're doing.
Right.
But I do think that between the two, you can at least make the argument that Miami's got a little bit more of a pedigree within this, because A&M this season, outside of the Notre Dame game, Miami's win against Notre Dame, you could argue, was a little bit more impressive. A&M's kind of relied on, some unexpected special teams miscues.
Right.
And they also beat Notre Dame at a time when I feel like people were still trying to figure out what this A&M team was going to be. There wasn't a lot of tape on them, and there wasn't a lot of clear sense of how they were going to perform. You've now gotten that, and it feels like as there's been more tape on A&M, it's been harder to play against them.
Yeah.
Whereas with Miami, yes, they swooned in the middle of the year, but they seem to have put it together nicely over the course of this last couple of weeks of the regular season. Now, that said, A&M's got the home field advantage, and Kyle Field is a unique home field advantage. Like
100%.
that is one of the stealthily hardest places to go in and play. And Miami has not fared particularly well on the road. They barely left the state of Florida, and it didn't really go that well when they did. So I do wonder how that will play into Miami's ability to perform, because they did do pretty good work at home, whereas A&M has at least demonstrated they can do some things away from home.
It's a good point. And, Miami did have to go they played at Pitt a couple weeks ago. I know they're not going to be playing in the snow or anything or any cold weather, but at least that I
think we can stop pretending Pitt is good.
Right? Yeah, it was more or less they went on the road and won a game, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So they did something there. And so that's what makes this matchup so curious. It's an 11 a.m. local kick. Miami, outside of that Pitt game, really have not played great, haven't had to play many road games. I know they won at Florida State earlier in the season. So certainly this is an interesting dynamic of two teams. Like Miami hasn't won a playoff game since the BCS era. Texas A&M has never won a playoff game, so you have that too. The fans are really – this is a fan base that's ignited, that really has always wanted to be successful, and they're just not. So I'm curious how all those factors play. And the 11 a.m. kick time is – a lot of people are complaining about it, but I'm sorry, ESPN was not going to punt this game and give it to TNT. So that's why this landed here, right?
Yes, exactly.
And so – I think it's going to be the most fun game of the weekend, and we'll talk about the next game next, but this is going to be I think the best game of the weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. It's a 3.5-point spread right now in favor of Texas A&M. FEI has it as a 0.4 of a point difference. It's essentially a statistical dead heat, barely favoring A&M. I have no idea what direction I'm going to go. I'd probably, in that case, I'd opt, if I'm betting the spread, I'm probably taking Miami in the points, because this could be one of those 1 or 2 point games. But I think this is a game where, I'm leaning Miami in terms if I was picking them to win straight up, simply because I think they're a little more explosive offensively and they have a more tested quarterback, and those things generally start to come into play in games like this.
Oh yeah, agreed. And will this be, or we'll talk about this in a second, will this be our first road team winning a playoff game?
Yeah, it's very possible. All right, last game, Oklahoma, Alabama, the no offense bowl. As neither of these teams, Oklahoma hasn't looked good offensively all year, and Alabama has not looked offensively good in the last 5 weeks of the season. It's a curious case with Alabama, because it's hard to tell if Alabama's woes on offense are fixable. If it was just a momentary thing. We don't know if Ty Simpson's really injured or not. There were several people on the Alabama injury list that we saw come out yesterday that makes you wonder how complete they're going to be. Oklahoma just beat them in Tuscaloosa, and this game is in Norman. But Oklahoma is also probably the most one-dimensional team in the entire 12-team playoff field. And even though they are favored by 0.2 of a point in FEI. And I think straight up, or excuse me, in the spread, the actual spread is Alabama -1.5. So this is even closer, perceptionally speaking, than A&M Miami. What's your read on this one?
This feels, if you're putting this in the Big Ten context, this feels like an Iowa, like Wisconsin, like 10-7. Ball's not going to move very much. It's going to be very tough to watch. We've talked about these teams a lot this year because they've been on the precipice of making the playoff, not making the playoff. Oklahoma has played the same game 3 straight weeks against Bama, against, which was last week, drawing a blank. But they've played this same game over and over again, and it's like they haven't really put forth any offensive effort or much offensive points at all. They've scored one big play in each of the last couple of games, and that's really been it. On the other side, Alabama has not played well. I know they got credit for the Auburn win a couple weeks ago by the committee because they were up 17-0 at one point. But then, Auburn comes roaring back. And so we haven't seen the complete Alabama team since maybe the Georgia game or maybe a little bit after that. It's the most interesting game because you have Alabama who maybe has the most talent on their roster in the playoff, but has not looked good in over probably a month and a half. And you have Oklahoma, who has won all these close games. Their defensive front seven's maybe the best in the country, playing in a game that is obviously really important. Obviously, it's a playoff game. It's really important in Norman. And let's also at this point, Brent Venables is 2-0 against Kalen DeBoer in 2 years. So he could potentially win his third game against Kalen DeBoer here. So certainly there's a lot at obviously a really big game. Great that's an SEC versus SEC here. I really do think it's like a 17-10 game, maybe 14-10. I don't expect a lot of points at all, just based on how well these defenses play and how the offenses have looked all season.
Yeah, the one thing about Kalen DeBoer, though, is none of those losses to Brent Venables have happened in the playoff. And this is a guy that did win a playoff game while he was at Washington and had Washington in position where they were at least competitive for the national title. Yeah. It's going to be interesting. And I think Alabama is the more complete team, but I don't know if they're going to be healthy enough to be able to go on the road in a night game and pull off a victory against an Oklahoma team that can drag you into deep water with a lot of effectiveness if you don't have the offensive tools to fight back. So, yeah, it's going to be a really fascinating game from a variety of perspectives, not just the head-up roster competition between these two, not just because we saw these teams play a month ago, but also because you think back to the road games that we had last year, and you think about the matchups and the fact that Indiana had to go on the road and play a really physically tough Notre Dame team in incredibly cold conditions. Tennessee had to go on the road and play an Ohio State team that probably was the most talented team in the entire playoffs. This is a different kind of thing. These are relatively evenly matched teams. How big is the home field advantage going to be in Norman for Oklahoma against an Alabama team that certainly isn't going to be scared of that kind of an environment? Mm-hmm. That's the part of it that I'm the most interested in seeing play out, and especially a night game with a coach that knows how to win in the playoff with Kalen DeBoer. What kind of an advantage does that give him against a Brent Venables team? Because Brent Venables, you mentioned, has beaten him twice. These are all things that I really have no idea how to predict, and I don't think anybody really does.
The one thing, if you're Alabama, if you look at the box score from last game, right? Alabama almost outgained them 2-1. They turned the ball over 3 times. Their longest drive was 40 yards. Oklahoma scored on an 87-yard interception return. Then it was, it was a really wonky game. They hate to use the word weird, but it was a weird game for them. That how they won the game, but it still counts, and that's how they earned this home game at the end of the day. But it would seem like Alabama should look at this and say, if we just play mistake-free football, we should win this game. But it is on the road in Oklahoma, a couple weeks off. It will be a lot tighter it will be very similar to this game, very tight.
It's one thing to say, oh, yeah, we'll play mistake-free football. You couldn't do that at home.
Yeah.
In a less pressure-filled environment. You now got to go on the road in the playoff with a quarterback that might be injured.
Yeah.
And certainly did not look like himself in the SEC championship game. And that might be the one thing I keep in the back of my head. Alabama went in to Athens and beat Georgia at Georgia earlier on in the season. They feel like a much different team now. And we saw that in the SEC title game where they didn't look like a shell of themselves in that game. Is that the same thing that we see having to play Oklahoma a second time?
No, 100%. Yeah, I mean, that game 2 weeks ago looked like it could have been 42-49-7. It wasn't competitive. And as you said, that game that game that was in Athens, they looked like the better team throughout that game. But it's it certainly has the winds have changed, and we'll be interested to see what Ty Simpson looks like, because he looked like, as you mentioned, he was really injured last week. So, but Oklahoma's defense is really good. That front seven is amazing. There's a couple NFLers on that line that will probably dictate this game. I don't know which way I'm leaning. Are you going Oklahoma here?
I'm leaning Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And as much as I think Alabama can absolutely win, I think the home field advantage combined with the uncertainty of where Alabama really is at this point. They limped into the last game of that season, of the regular season. We saw it in Auburn. If you can't compete at Auburn and you need a last-minute touchdown in the red zone on a fourth down, and then they really only stopped Auburn.
Forced a fumble, yeah.
By forcing a fumble. I do worry in a live round situation against an Oklahoma team that's had some time to rest up and maybe figure a few things out.
No, I'm with you. I think I'm going to lean Oklahoma here as well. It's only a 1.5, I think, as of right now. So it's an even game. I mean, as you said, it's like less than 1/10 of a point. So we're going to have two really good games to start off the playoff weekend in terms of just the spread and what the numbers say. And this one feels like one of those games that's going to be really tight.
Yeah. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back with our interview with Bryan Curtis of The Ringer, and then we'll take another break and come back, and we will talk about the Michigan coaching situation and a couple of the bowl games going on across college football. Don't go anywhere. For Matt Blaszka, he's over there. I'm Galen Clavio. This is Football Weather. Be with you in just a minute.
Hoosier Nation, are you tired of the same old takes? Say hello to Crimson Cast, the podcast that actually knows IU sports. Hosted by Galen Clavio and Scott Caulfield, they serve up sharp analysis, real talk, and just enough sarcasm to keep things interesting. Game previews? Check. Instant reactions? Double check. History lessons that make even our losses worth remembering? You bet. So whether you're tailgating at Memorial Stadium, pacing around Assembly Hall, or just avoiding Purdue fans, Crimson Cast has you covered. Search Crimson Cast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and join the conversation today.
And joining us on the show, as promised, from The Ringer, editor-at-large Bryan Curtis, a good friend of mine. We've been doing things on and off media-wise, it feels like, for several years now, and we've yet to really have the college football conversation, but it's great that we're able to have this conversation now. Bryan, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
This feels like the perfect year for it, Galen. I mean, has there been any news out of Indiana?
A little bit. Yeah, I think this is actually a great place for us to start. You, obviously, as a native of the state of Texas and as a UT Austin alum, are very used to the college football landscape in a way that many IU fans are completely, maybe not completely, but are just now learning. What has the perception been outside of Indiana football suddenly being not just a cute story like some might have looked at it last year, but as like a team that you really have to acknowledge in the national conversation, especially now with a Heisman Trophy winner?
Shock, disbelief. And I say that, and I honestly think that lasted up to the moment that Mendoza threw that pass in the Big Ten championship game, which was one of the best pressure passes I've seen in a really, really long time. I think the whole world was just like, wait, what? They're not just a nice story. It's not just Kurt Zagetti as a fun turnaround story like it was last year, but this is a team that can easily win the national championship. It may be the favorite to win the national championship. And again, talking to people who just are not used to talking about IU in that context at all. And I think they're still flabbergasted.
It's an interesting environment, too, because, we're used to news stories popping up in, say, college basketball or in, even in the NFL. I mean, the Lions were a laughingstock for, pretty much their entire history in the NFL. And then suddenly, hey, they're in the NFC title game. It doesn't feel like that foreign of a concept. But college football has been so insular in who the blue bloods are and who's actually competing at that level. I've had a hard time thinking of the last new kind of nouveau riche program that's come up and forced itself into the conversation, especially in such a short time frame as what we've seen out of IU these last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, you could, point to the TCU's cameo in the national championship game. We know how that turned out and what's happened since then. You could point at Michael Vick and Virginia Tech maybe, but it's a pretty short list. And obviously it's short partly because you had playoff structures only let 2 teams into the national championship game for a long time, and then 4 teams in that were built in such a way that they were going to take nouveau riche programs off the table. unless something extraordinary happened, like they went undefeated in a big conference. So yeah, it's a tiny list. Absolutely.
I want to kind of broaden out a little bit and talk about first the media reaction to the CFP committee, and particularly the Notre Dame versus Alabama conversation. There's always going to be controversy with committees. We're used to that by now, especially with the basketball tournament, but it's normally not as high stakes as what it feels like with college football. When you saw, especially the reaction to Notre Dame being left out, as a media critic and someone that studies this space, like, what was your reaction, I guess, to how vitriolic the response kind of felt like because of that brand being left out, and especially with it being Alabama as the team that got put in again under maybe some questionable circumstances?
I thought it was hilarious, honestly. I really did. For a couple of reasons. One, if it had gone the other way, we'd be having exactly the opposite conversation. That Notre Dame is pulling all the puppet strings and they're running college football, and the committee is, worshiping at the altar of Notre Dame. And there's no way for them to miss the playoff, right? We would be having actually that conversation. But, the other thing about it that's funny to me, and I think that we in the media don't do a good job of admitting, is that we have a great self-interest in being mad at the committee, whatever decision they make, right? If we're like, look at the field of 12, go, pretty good. I mean, the plug gets pulled on your podcast right then. You don't get to write a column because you have nothing to say. We have this great tradition here where if you look at the people that cover college football, their careers are built on being mad at the bowl system, being mad at the BCS, being mad at the 14 playoff when they leave out teams like undefeated Florida State, and now being mad at the 12-team playoff, even though the only controversy is who the 9 and 10 seeds are, teams with 2 losses each. Right? That's a different order of magnitude than leaving Florida State out. So to me, when I look around at my friends in the media, including people I really, really like, I'm like, would you have ever not been mad? Like, what is the scenario that could have happened in that committee room that you look at and go, fine? I actually don't think there is one. And then add into that, of course, rival sites, they're playing to their fan bases, all the network stuff, which we can get into between ESPN and Fox, where they're all taking shots at each other, the CAA stuff. I mean, there's just so many levels to this that I actually don't think it's possible for people to be happy.
Yeah, it seems like no matter what you do, you're going to be arguing 8 or 9 or 9-10 or 16-17 if you expand the playoff, right? So it doesn't really change the argument. It just moves the frame of where you're actually going to argue about that. So I guess I'm curious where you see maybe this playoff going, how Fox and ESPN are fighting over these last couple spots, and how you see that going forward.
Well, I honestly think, it sounds like they'll get rid of the ranking show, or at least there's some momentum to get rid of it. Whenever somebody says we're getting rid of television programming, I was like, really? You're going to give the money back? We're like, why don't we shorten the NBA season by 15 games? Oh, yeah? You're going to get part of that $7 billion back now? Because that never happened in my lifetime under any circumstances. So you could see them getting rid of that. But honestly, people that are like, oh, SEC, ESPN, I'm like, you remember when Alabama got left out last year? You guys remember that happening? That was 1 year ago. And again, we had the exact opposite argument where Nick Saban was, sitting there in his crimson jacket in front of the crimson pool table during the selection show, just like he was this year, by the way. And we're like, oh, look at the conspiracy, but it didn't work, right? It didn't happen between ESPN. I think, by the way, a healthier way that this could have all gone down a couple of years ago is that they would have split up the college football playoff between networks like they did the NFL playoffs. And I know that was an expectation, and ESPN essentially just came in with a Godfather offers that actually we're going to buy the whole thing. But, to me, some of this is what you're saying is jealousy. Could that happen somewhere down the line when they renegotiate it? Maybe. But I think this is a system we got, and I think we're going to see tweaks rather than wide-scale changes at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting because we keep seeing shots being fired. Brady Quinn had some comments today about this, the perception that ESPN's putting their thumb on the scale with the committee and the way that the whole thing lays out, because of the fact that it's all on one network and the selection show the committee show is on that same network. It's hard to get away from that. I don't know if there's really a functional approach that you can take with something like this where it doesn't feel like somebody's doing some gatekeeping. And it's interesting because no one questions who makes the NFL playoffs. It's very clear at the beginning of the year, like that if you're a division winner, you're going to make it. And if you're one of the top 3 wild cards, and here are the tiebreakers. But this is the unique aspect of college football that a lot of people don't get, which is that the NFL was conceived as a singular entity with rules. College football was conceived as a bunch of other little entities, plus Notre Dame, who had their own rules. And this is the kind of brokered piece to try to get all those people in the same room. It's not just, you can't just snap your fingers and say, well, we're all going to abide by these rules when you don't even have conferences playing the same number of games against each other.
No. And the fact that we should almost count ourselves lucky that we had a metric to separate Notre Dame and Miami. They actually played each other. And then we had to do the whole, they played it was at the beginning of the season. Like, that's about as head-to-head as you get in a fractured system like the one you're talking about. No, I completely agree. And I just think, you think about like, what would the solution to this be? And of course, we immediately go to, let's put 16 teams in. I'm like, well, if you hate the committee and you hate what they're doing, why do you want to give them more teams? Like, is that a good, is that something to think about? And I did read Brady Quinn's comments. And honestly, to me, I can't really follow the plot from one, does ESPN have a vested interest in the SEC and the ACC being good and feeling like really big time football? Absolutely. Should they? I think they'd be a lot more transparent about that when they're talking about these things. Hey, we're the network of the SEC. Sure. That should be on game day a lot more than it is. Just like the Lane Kiffin, agent stuff should have been on game day. Yeah. So we can make journalistic points about that. But I just think in the grand scheme of things, look, those Tuesday night ranking shows, who got a lot of content out of that besides ESPN? All of us that talk about college football. Every college football podcast was mad on Tuesday night all year long. Like the controversy is built in the system, like you say, but it's also, we feed off that. We gain a lot of that. Again, I think it's just important for us to be honest about that. Like, the worse a job, quote unquote, that they do, the better it is for all of us that feed in this ecosystem.
And at the end of the day, you're still getting some really dynamite matchups. The other controversy that's maybe not caught as much fire as I thought it might at the beginning of last week is the inclusion of the 2 group of 5 schools, James Madison and Tulane, in the mix at the expense of another power conference team. This is an interesting aspect of college football that you don't see at all in college basketball, where people celebrate the underdogs in college basketball. We celebrate the first round upsets. It's treated in college football like an affront to the fabric of the game. Like, how dare we not have an ACC team or another SEC team in because we've got this team from the Sun Belt that's managed to qualify. And this kind of comes back to a larger point that I've been talking about on the show with Matt over the course of the last couple of months. It feels like, to me, the biggest issue right now in college football and college athletics is money. The need for more revenue. I was at the Intercollegiate Athletics Forum in Las Vegas this last week, which that had some fireworks to it that we could talk about at some various moments. My favorite was Brett Yormark going right after Pete Bevacqua in that session that I was sitting in. No one quite saw that coming. But one of the things I heard, and Ross Bjork, the Ohio State AD, brought this up, is like, we are so undercapitalized in terms of our television rights compared to other sports that don't have nearly the same level of viewership. Like the NBA earns like 6 or 7 times the revenue off of its broadcast rights, but has significantly less actual demonstrated ratings interest. And part of it to me is like, you almost need to try to find a way to get college football to be more universal, not more constricted. You need to get more people involved and interested in watching the games. And this is where the group of 5 thing, on the one hand, it's like, well, you could have a bigger brand in there, but don't you need to grow the audience for the sport so that more people want to watch games, not fewer people want to watch games because it's just their team that's involved?
I agree. And I think you need to at least dangle the idea that those teams can win the national championship. And again, let's just do the reverse thing again. Who were the martyrs of this system or the various systems we've had every single year until this year? It was the small schools that we were leaving out, despite the fact that they went undefeated or had great seasons. Right? How many years was that Boise? How many years do we hear that? Now you let them in, and it's the opposite argument. Well, they're not one of the 12 best teams in the country. I agree. I don't think James Madison is, but you designed this system specifically because you didn't want to let the flaws of the other system take over. So what are you going to do? And I agree with you. I think you just, if you open the door, it's fun. Look, we may get a blowout against Oregon and we may be like, well, that was a waste of time. But it's fun to have teams like that in. And it does make college football at least give it the illusion that it is one big thing and not just two big power conferences running everything.
Yeah, I think that's, one of the misnomers is last year we had 4 blowouts in the first round. I know there was, Indiana came back a little bit, but generally speaking, the 4 games were not close for most of those games. So to say that JMU or Tulane may not be close, I know Tulane got blown out earlier. It's as you said, it's a good time to grow the sport and see what else is out there for these, for the fan. And I think, obviously they're going up against the NFL Saturday, so that obviously plays an interesting piece in this with the TBS broadcast piece, right, of how they were given these 2 games. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and how they pick these games for going up against the NFL.
It's pretty obvious, right? They sacrificed the 2 games to the NFL schedule, and ESPN, which gets to pick which one's going to TBS, was like, here you go, we're going to sell you these guys. That was it's funny how that laid out, isn't it? I mean, and again, I think some of this is like just being hard-headed, right? College football is just, on the one hand, they want to be inclusive. On the other hand, they want to have the ratings be as good as they can be. You want to have great matchups. Look, here's the other thing we could discuss about the committee. I actually think there's some, I don't know if integrity is the word I'd ever use for any college football committee ever, but there's a certain kind of integrity when you locked yourself into a system where you had 2 rematches in the first round. Oklahoma, Alabama, we just had a couple of weeks ago, and then Tulane, Ole Miss, which was a blowout earlier in the season. Like, if you were really trying to rig this up, you would not have put those matchups in the first round at all. And you make a great point. Last year, hey, Ohio State, Tennessee, right? Notre Dame. We had all these great matchups in the first round. They turned out to be terrible too. So maybe it won't matter that much.
Yeah. It's also, I think, one of the other aspects that I'm fascinated by is that network partnership component with TBS coming in. But then you think about even the regular season, NBC's had a lot of complaints about their part of the Big Ten deal over the course of the last 2 years because I guess they didn't read the contract effectively enough. They aren't in line to get the right games. They're like, when do we get Ohio State? And Fox is like, yeah, we're going to take that every week, guys. Sorry. CBS does seem to have clawed out a little bit of a space where they've adopted Oregon as their primary team. And that's a good thing to have in the marketplace overall. But it is interesting, like the Big Ten clearly went for an NFL-style media deal where they're like, we're going to partner with all the media outlets and we're going to have them all doing our stuff, whereas ESPN and the SEC went the opposite direction. Like, do you feel like there's one approach or the other that's more likely to pay greater dividends longer term for either of those conferences at this point?
Well, I think in the Big Ten's case, they were just trying to maximize dollars, and in the moment you could say, hey, if you take that deal, we have 3 networks that are all going to make you their game of the week. Why not? And as we've seen it, some of that's a construction of the conference. Like, what was one of the best games in college football this year? IU at Oregon. Absolutely. Both in practice and on paper. And you looked at the rating of that game and you're like, it didn't do that well compared to like SEC game of the week, because I think people just don't understand it. They look, your normie college football fan is like, why are those 2 teams playing? Wait, they're in the same conference. Wait, they're both good. Like, it just doesn't compute like Alabama, Auburn, which is, again, not that interesting a game this year. So that's what I would think you would want those 3 partners. Again, it's just the hard part is it's like when you're out of ESPN, again, ESPN, even in its diminished state, even in its weakened state, even in a state, by the way, where it has to sell games to TBS to get some money back because they're so leveraged with all these sports rights as their app rolls out. Being away from ESPN is still really hard because it's just whenever we can say all we want that they're smaller, but man, they really do control the conversation, especially with game day, especially with, First Take and all the way it trickles down through all those shows. They're just such an ESPN effect.
Yeah. Last question I got for you. I wanted to get your impressions of Heisman weekend and particularly the Diego Pavia corner of this weekend. I've been trying to think back. I mean, the Heisman Trophy ceremony, I don't know that a lot of people pay attention to it unless they have a player of theirs that they're specifically interested in. So I'll be the first to say something like this might have happened before, but Indiana hasn't had a player in the finalist pool since 2001. But I'm struggling to think of not just the during the week stuff that Pavia did, just with his brothers being there and the way that he was dressed and his whole approach towards the media, but then everything that happened afterwards that popped up on social media, and then like what clearly looks like an AI generated apology popping up this morning. This felt like one of those unicorn events we may never quite see again in conjunction with something like the Heisman Trophy.
It did feel very special. It felt like when I'm looking at somebody much younger than me, when I look at their social media, I'm like, whoa, that's what's going on these days. You know, like, such an old man. And honestly, to me, you can almost twin it with Mendoza. If you go back to Mendoza's interview after the Ohio State game and then his speech, the Heisman Trophy. And I'm like, I think I've lost track what we in the media think is the appropriate attitude for a quarterback to have these days, because he was weirdly getting like, hey, are we sure about this Mendoza guy? He's like the nicest person in the world. I'm like, wait, what? Because he's not enough of a jerk. You know, I did like his use of the word flippin', which I only saw 90 sports writers use in columns when they were trying to avoid swear words. You know, that was a new one for me. Just in that kind of joke. But that was funny to me because I looked at both of them and I was like, on the one hand, you can look at the Pavia stuff and be like, dude, that's a lot. You know, a lot going on there. On the other hand, maybe somebody looks at that and I was like, that guy wants to win and screw everybody else. Use another 90s sports columnist word. And on the other hand, you look at Mendoza and be like, man, that just looks like you drew up that athlete. You know, yes, sir, no, sir. Here we go. Great attitude. Doing charity work on Heisman weekend. This is fantastic. And then maybe somebody looks at that and I was like, you know, that person doesn't have enough edge to win in the NFL. I don't know if I'd spend a 1-1 on him.
It reminds me. It reminds me weirdly of the Peyton Manning Ryan Leaf argument from a quarter century ago, where Manning was clearly the more studious, training and intelligence focused quarterback, but Leaf had that edge, and that's what you really wanted. And there was this real argument that you got to draft Leaf first because that guy's a winner. And well, we saw how that played out. Over the course of their careers. I just got a lot of vibes from that with this, but it is an interesting way that some people choose to evaluate quarterback candidates, especially where it's like if they have too much of an edge, it's a problem, but if they don't appear to have an edge at all, it's also a problem, ignoring whatever has actually happened on the field throughout the course of the season.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Mendoza compared to Andrew Luck, which I thought was an interesting comp. And, he had the same kind of thing where he's like, hey, we're worried about him because he majored in architecture. He seems to have other thoughts in his mind. I'm like, Andrew Luck turned out fine.
His Wonderlic was too high,
he was too high.
Or something like.
Yeah, Andrew Luck's perceived lack of edge didn't seem to get in the way too much. So we're okay with that.
It's been really difficult for me as a Jets fan to watch this play out, as I want the kid to be on my team, but I really don't want to ruin his life. So I'm hoping the Jets somehow screw this up.
Yeah. Whose life are they going to ruin? Is the question.
Yeah, I did see. It was funny, like watching Raiders fans celebrating their loss yesterday on social media, and then starting to play "Fernando" by ABBA in the background of the social media that they were creating. It's like Jets or Raiders. If I'm Fernando Mendoza, I'm like, do I have an extra year of eligibility? Can I come back? And maybe it's a different team.
Be like Clavio and sue college football again.
Yeah,
right. Well, Bryan, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and obviously a fascinating space with college football in particular and how it's getting covered. And look forward to maybe having you on again sometime in the summer as we see what happens with this playoff and how they decide to reset things for the next one, as Jim Phillips apparently indicated that they're still negotiating about expanding this thing. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. Thanks so much for having me, and see you in Pasadena.
We'll see you there.
When the final buzzer sounds in Bloomington, the conversation starts here. The assembly call is IU basketball. Live post-game shows, smart midweek breakdowns, and no empty hot takes. Jared Morris, Coach Brian Tonsoni, Andy Bottoms, and Ryan Phillips Dissect lineups, sets, and recruiting so you know what really happened and what it means for the Big Ten season, March, and beyond. Join the live chat on YouTube, then catch the podcast on Spotify and Apple. Just search Assembly Call and be part of Hoosier Nation's most trusted post-game tradition.
Welcome back to Football Weather. Thank you to Bryan Curtis again for joining us. That was a great interview. We enjoy chatting with Bryan on a regular basis. Sorry for the costume change and the venue change there. Well, Matt was still in the same place. I went about 4 miles east, and then I came back again. So here we are.
Perfect.
It's great. Anyway, let's talk first this whole Michigan mess. Sharon Moore fired for cause. Just a complete mess of a situation. No clue yet about what Michigan does with their coaching search, but that's a program that this has been a weird last few years for them. I mean, they went from essentially clearly being a step behind Ohio State to surpassing Ohio State, winning a Big Ten title, winning a national title. Jim Harbaugh leaves under a cloud of allegations. And then 2 years under Moore as head coach where they were like not great in either season. They were a little bit better this year. Now, what do they do? Where do they go with this? What do they need to do to restore, I guess, the brand of Michigan football? And, you know, I almost feel like, Matt, this is going to be a much more complicated situation for Michigan to navigate out of than it's being portrayed as right now. People are acting like, well, they just need to hire a new coach and they'll be fine. Kind of feels like the whole infrastructure needs to be ripped up a bit and rebuilt.
From all reports, right, they're doing an entire internal investigation. I guess Ward Manuel's making the hire. It seems like he's going, which is weird, right? I don't know what to say about it.
I think it's insane that he somehow still has a job. I mean, there's a graphic that's been floating around about all of the Michigan coaches that have been sanctioned now by the NCAA or been fired. It's like a list of like 12 or 13 people, some of them football, some of them other sports. It's really remarkable when you think about scandals in other athletic departments that Ward Manuel is not just still there, but is in charge of this search, apparently.
It doesn't, yeah. I mean, so let's assume he's the one making the decision, or if he's not, then who is? Because they also have an interim president. They don't have a president right now either. It's very similar to the LSU situation, but this is obviously a scandal compared to LSU just not having their ducks in a row. Yeah. This is a top 5 job in the country, top 10, right? People want this job. Kenny Dillingham, we use him as an example. He has said no to every other job. He did not say no to this job. So it obviously has the prestige of maybe what he's looking for. It does seem like they do have a slight runway since everyone's hired. They're the only job that's open, or at least big job that's open at this point. And the only names we've heard, I think, officially are Dillingham, and I know DeBoer came out and said he's going to be the Alabama coach next year. Now, if they lose, that certainly, I think, changes the dynamic of what that looks like. If you're one of those sitting coaches, you have no idea who you're working for. You have no idea who the president is. It becomes a little more interesting in that aspect from who they can get, because we keep, as Indiana, as we're here locally in Indiana, every time Curt Cignetti talks, he thanks the president, he thanks the AD for the support. And that's a really important factor that a lot of these coaches want and need in that job. And so while they're in this situation, they don't have anybody leading the group to where this needs to go. I assume that at some point they'll just clean house entirely. But then if you're looking at this job, what are you going to be given to take the reins of this particular job, which is a top 5 job?
Well, you're going to have a ton of resources at your disposal. And this is where I think some people forget how insanely wealthy Michigan's alumni and boosters are. The Bryce Underwood situation last year is a great example of that, where they were basically like, well, it's a blank check. What do we need to get this guy here? And so I think that makes it attractive to a bunch of people. But it then goes back to this question mark of, do you know who you're going to be working for? And are you going to be aligned with those people? And the Curt Cignetti thing is a great example. The James Franklin piece at Penn State is the opposite example of that, where you get a new athletic director that comes in, and after a while, if you're not winning at a high enough level for the station that you're at, there's going to be a change that gets made, and you're not going to have an ally in the building. And I do wonder with Dillingham, especially, whether he's legitimately serious about the job or whether he's using it to try to leverage Arizona State to get their donors to pay for additional NIL money, additional staff money, because that's what we've seen with a lot of these coaches that have had their names in the kitty. The BYU coach ended up, whether or not he was intending to go to Penn State or not, or whether it was a situation where he was just leveraging it, he got a lot in support of BYU football as a result of that. And we've seen that play out in several other spots. And the whole fit idea and this idea that you want to be somewhere where you can get enough resources to win, but maybe not be in a spot like Kalen DeBoer finds himself in at Alabama right now, where the expectation is you must win at this high level all the time. That's what, to some degree, I think Curt Cignetti finds so appealing about Indiana is A, he's built all of this himself. B, he's got presidential and athletic director and donor support. But C, if Curt Cignetti has an off year where Indiana wins like 8 games or 9 games, everybody's going to be like, that's still an amazing season. Whereas if he goes to a Penn State or a Michigan or an Alabama, you're on the hot seat all of a sudden. So I do wonder with Dillingham, as much as he has stated that he loves Arizona State, how serious is he about this? Because Michigan people seem to think he's pretty serious about it right now.
You know, the idea of a Michigan man running this program, that I would assume that's going to go out the window here, since all these guys were Michigan men, and you know they are leader of men, leader of football. And you make a good point. Like, it's not going to be a situation where you can go 9-3 or 8-4. You have to get to the playoff. Maybe not in year one, because you're going to have a really wonky year one at this point with how it's going to play out with the portal and maybe hiring and everything else. But certainly by year 2, you're, especially in this new era, you only have a year or 2 years. And Michigan, you know, before Harbaugh was very quick to pull the hook. They pulled the hook on a couple guys, and didn't really let that more than a 3-year, 4-year runway. And there's a certain way you play at Michigan, right? They're not known for wanting to throw the ball. They tried that with Rich Rodriguez and said, you know what, we're not doing that. We're going to do it this way.
They're kind of the Chicago Bears of college football from that perspective, and that you don't expect a passing game out of them because we've never seen it before.
Right, and to their credit, that's your play up north, and you know you play Michigan. You're going to have more games like that. I understand that, but certainly they're going to have to take probably a bigger view here of what do we really want from this coach? And if it's not Dillingham or if it's not DeBoer, who is it? Like, there's not really another name, if you will, out there that's right out there that's going to jump at this job, especially with, like as we said at the beginning here, no up top, you know, structure at this point.
Well, and the other thing I'll note on this that I think is interesting in how it ends up playing out is Michigan. There's additional pressure on whoever the coach is at Michigan, which is that Ohio State just won the national title last year. 3 teams made the playoff this year from the Big Ten. One of them was Indiana. I think Michigan fans will begrudge Ohio State making the playoff if they don't, because that makes sense in their brains. I think that they could begrudgingly accept Penn State making it. Indiana making the playoff, Oregon making the playoff instead of Michigan is not culturally acceptable to Michigan, because whatever rank Michigan is amongst the best jobs, whether it's a top 5 job, a top 10 job, they view themselves as a premier job.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Indiana making the playoff, or you know, any one of a number of Ole Miss making the playoff and Michigan not, is not going to sit well with them any more than Alabama not making the playoff and other teams making it doesn't sit well with those fans. I don't think that this recalibration that we keep hearing about in college football about, well, you're not going to make the playoff every year, you're not going to go undefeated every year. Michigan strikes me as a prime place where that's not going to reconcile particularly well with their fans and particularly with their donors, because they're going to look at it as their birthright to win 11 or 12 games and be in the playoff every year, especially with teams that where it's not their birthright are in that mix. That's going to be a really fascinating dynamic for whoever that coach is.
Well, you mentioned the playoff, right? Out of we'll only use the last 2 years, the 12-team playoff. 3 of the 4 teams that made it both years, where are they from? The Big Ten.
That's right.
Ohio State, Indiana, and Oregon have both made it both years. That's not in the SEC. The other team is Georgia. Those are the only 4 teams that made it both times. So you're looking at that, and let's put Indiana aside. Now you're 2 years behind Ohio State. You're 2 years behind Oregon. That yes, you won your national championship 2 years ago, and it's pretty recent. So certainly you have maybe a little bit of a grace here. But this is a quick heel turn that wasn't really probably in the calculus of what they were expecting. They probably thought maybe Sherrone Moore was on the right track. Hard to say, really. You see reports that they were 9-3, but we watched that Ohio State game together. It never looked like they were in that game functionally. I watched the Oklahoma game earlier in the year. It didn't look like the offense was functional there either. So the teams they were beating were certainly in the lower half, and there's a lot of work to do here. Like Underwood said, he's going in the portal, I believe, right? So they already have to re-recruit the quarterback, and we don't know how good he is. He was a freshman last year. It's going to be a heavy lift, and there's going to be an expectation for you to win right away. I just don't know how Michigan's going to handle that.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how they end up coming to a conclusion on who they hire. Every day that we don't get an announcement about Dillingham makes me think that's not the choice. Because why wouldn't they have just hired him at this point?
Right. So are you taking the field then?
I'm going to take the field. I am curious about the DeBoer thing because that was not a denial of an interest in the job. No. And so my antenna are up a little bit there. And so let's just keep an eye on it. But if it's not either of those two, I'm very fascinated to see who they would go get at that point. It's not a clear choice from that point forward about what direction they would go.
Especially every person that was at their school, like alumni, or they all re-up. The only one that left was Lane Kiffin. Everyone else is re-up. So there's not like this guy that's just sitting there hasn't signed a contract in the last month that you would think, okay, that's the guy. There's nobody there.
Well, there's always Brian Kelly.
He's available.
He's available.
Yeah.
That would
be something.
I want advance notice if that's the hire, because I want to buy as much popcorn as humanly possible so I can sit back and watch Michigan be set aflame by their fans.
We will do the best live pod in the history of this pod if that happens.
No question. No question at all. Oh, my goodness. Real quick, as we wrap up, we've been neglectful of bowl season. We're going to hit this a little bit more, I think, early next week. We've got some time, and most of the big bowls don't really get going until Saturday the 27th. So we're trying to stretch this out. There's a lot to talk about. But are there 2 or 3 bowl matchups that have stuck out to you as being particularly interesting that you're really excited to see going into this group of games?
This game this week? Yeah, I'd like to see well, first let's it's Delaware's first ever bowl game. They'll be playing tonight. So if you're listening to this today, they're playing tonight. I'm really curious to see what NC State and Memphis look like. Memphis lost their coach too, and how that affects them. They had a really good season. They're really close to making the playoff. NC State has some really interestingly good wins this year, so that'll be a good one. Outside of that, there's not really much till next week. I am curious to see. Man, we're getting down there. Probably the Clemson Penn State game, which will take place after Christmas. The preseason All-American trophy, whatever you want to call this bowl game, the
hypothetical national championship,
the hypothetical national championship game, and obviously, who can not want to see the Pop-Tart Bowl between who's the Pop-Tart Bowl?
Georgia Tech and BYU, yes.
BYU, yes, it's Georgia Tech, BYU. And that's on next Saturday. So that's the biggest bowl day before during the holidays is that Saturday. So there's other games that obviously that will come up, but I love bowl season. I mean, I love this because there's just nothing else going on. You can turn on a game, and it can be Delaware, whoever they're playing. It doesn't matter. I'm all in. How about you?
I agree. I agreed with Memphis. NC State is a really intriguing matchup, and I don't know what to make of Memphis post Silverfield. That might not be a good team anymore, but we'll see. I'll take a detour from the bowls to say I'm really fascinated to watch both FCS semifinals.
Oh, yeah.
This has been – I haven't followed the FCS playoffs as closely, but I've always watched 2 or 3 games every year. This has been a dynamite FCS playoffs. This has been amazing. And Montana State rematch a month after the game where Montana State upset Montana. That's going to be a great game. That's at 4:00 on Saturday of this upcoming weekend, and Montana State's favored in this one, whereas obviously Montana was, I think, a pretty heavy favorite in the first one. Montana State's hosting it. But, I mean, to me, the big one is the game going on in Philadelphia at 7:30 on Saturday night. Illinois State, who has
winning
a couple of upsets, and they are 11-4, and they travel to another upstart in Villanova, who ended up with an upset win, I think, over Tarleton State this past weekend. that's a 1.5-point spread. Either of those teams is going to be an amazing story if they get to the FCS championship, and they'll face either of the Montana schools, both of which would be great stories themselves. So I'm really, really excited to watch that. And I think as far as the regular bowls, the game I've got circled for a variety of reasons is the ReliaQuest Bowl on New Year's Eve, Vanderbilt and Iowa.
Ooh,
that's I'm endlessly curious how Diego Pavia bounces back from this entire Heisman thing this weekend and has to face an Iowa defense that's unlike most of what he has probably seen up to this point. This is a game where, as to borrow a phrase from earlier, Iowa specializes in dragging you into deep water. And this is a game that they have a real chance to do that. They're not going to be very dominant offensively, but Iowa against any SEC team is always a really curious matchup, because sometimes Iowa comes out and really causes problems, and other times Iowa comes out and does not cause problems at all. Which one will it be for this game?
Yeah. It always seems like Iowa, either they always play in Tampa or Nashville, it seems. They always seem to get those two bowl games, it seems like. That's a fascinating one. Also, is that Michigan-Texas game still fascinating, you think, on that same night? I don't know. It's interesting.
I don't know. I really don't know what to make of either of those teams, how Michigan reacts, if Texas has a whole lot to play for. The other thing to keep an eye on in this is what are the opt-outs? There was a tweet by the Notre Dame beat writer for The Athletic today about the number of players that would have opted out for Notre Dame had they played in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, and it was like 15 or 16 of their best players. And this is we talked about this a bunch. How do you motivate players to play in games that they really don't get anything out of except injury risk?
You're right.
So
just one last hurrah for some of the guys that aren't going to go to the NFL or something. That would be the one last chance. Yeah. I saw it was like 15 to 20 guys around that list. Is a big list of people or players.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll talk a lot more about the bowls on our next episode. We'll also recap what happened in the playoff games from this weekend. We'll also, I think, at some point over the course of the next couple of weeks before the quarterfinals happen, recap what happened with the coaching changes, since I think by that point they'll all be taken care of, and talk about some winners and losers as we head into portal season, which of course starts the first week of January. It's all coming up very soon here, Matt. All this gets compressed and all of this happens around the holidays. A lot to keep track of, obviously, in college football.
There's no sport like it. Free agency, coaching changes, playoffs, you name it. It's happening right now. There's probably something happening right now.
We probably missed a bunch just while we were recording.
But
anyway, we appreciate you folks joining us, and we will be back with more podcasts coming up soon. For Matt, I'm Galen. This is Football Weather. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.